fees are so high on Bitcoin Core that this person is having a trouble even sending the remaining amount to this young lady's wallet.
He has to keep making the amount lower and lower.
And he's having to make the amount lower and lower. So, and he's using a wallet other than Bitcoin.com wallet, which doesn't have a nice button to say send the maximum amount. So, but how much money do we have left there? Does it even say?
This isn't debt right now.
So we'll have an update there in a moment, since I think we have quite a few people.
Okay, so while we're doing that, the debate seems to have come to this: how to scale Bitcoin, what it is right now, and how to actually get to where they want it to be, or where people want it to be. So at the moment, there's no denying that anything that's not Bitcoin, most things that aren't Bitcoin, have cheaper transactions because they have less transactions in their blocks. They are less used, and that makes them cheaper by default, just as Bitcoin was when it was, when no one was really using it in those early days. As something becomes more and more popular, depending on the economics that you set up, if you allow these blocks to be full, then the fees of every transaction gets more expensive. As people stop using it or use it less, then the fees go down. They created this fee market, was where we originally started. Now,
So I disagree. The fee market is something that's very, very recent. Bitcoin grew from nothing into the worldwide phenomenon that it is today, having no fee market. And then a bunch of people came to Bitcoin much, much, much later and said, we need to change the underlying economic model of Bitcoin and introduce a fee market. And that fee market was just introduced very, very recently. And in the last year, we watched Bitcoin's market share amongst cryptocurrencies in terms of market cap go from 95% to about 35%. And that's as a direct result of changing the economic model of Bitcoin and making the transactions become slow, expensive, and unreliable due to this brand new fee market that was introduced by a bunch of people with very little to no economic or business background. Because if you think back to your university economics courses, there's something called substitute goods theory. And that's just a fancy way of saying that if you have two options for two things that do about the same thing, like Coke and Pepsi, or two different flavors of tea, if one costs less than the other, people will tend to use the one that costs less. And we've seen that happen with cryptocurrencies. There's 1,001 different cryptocurrencies that serve very similar functions. And for example, Bitcoin Cash, the fees are less than 1 yen. In fact, they're about 1/5 of a yen, gobun no ichi, in Tesurio for Bitcoin Cash transaction. And on Bitcoin Core, the fees are maybe 50 yen at the moment or so, depending on what it was. And last year, it was around 5,000 yen per transaction. So you have two versions of Bitcoin, one that's incredibly expensive to use in fees, and the other that's basically free. You don't have to be an economics major to figure out which one of those two is going to be more popular. And that's very clearly going to be Bitcoin Cash. And I'd love to hear why you might disagree.
Okay, so my belief is that BTC is a one-time freak innovation that won't happen again. I think it was created in a set of circumstances at a time that no one cared, and took years in order for people to actually start adopting it and gradually get more decentralized over time. So when Bitcoin was originally created, the same group of people were doing the mining, the same group of people were building wallets, the same group of people were doing development, the same group of people were doing everything, and gradually over time, it became more and more decentralized and distributed, and different people doing that. That took a while for that to happen. That took quite a long time to happen. Now, what it actually ended up creating is, I still believe to this day, and Roger might disagree, the most decentralized thing we have ever seen, which is BTC. The reason that I say that is because BTC has pockets of centralization, but none of them control the ecosystem, which was proven by the scaling debate. The fact of the matter is that while we might complain that this Bitcoin Core, which is, as far as I understand, a group of 100 different developers, 40 of them are more active, and 3 of them are very, very vocal and very, very important. And the complaint was that 3 of those were all hired by the same company, which was a company called Blockstream. Some of those have left now as well, so there's 2 left as far as I know. And that's where they believe that, that there is some kind of centralization within the development. But the development does not represent the entire ecosystem. The development is one part of the ecosystem, because the developers have to actually, in this, this group of 100 people, and there are competing. You can compete with this this implementation as well, but those 100 people all have completely different, wide and varied views. Now, over time, those that believed in bigger blocks, that wanted, and Gavin Andreessen and various other, Jeff Garzik, and Mike Hearn and various other developers, left the project because they decided, or some people talk about that they were forced to leave in some certain circumstances, which again, these needs investigating. But it tended to diverge upon a similar school of thought around that there will be unlimited demand for space on these blocks, and therefore you introduce a fee market to try and reduce spam was one of the things that they put through. And the second was they put together a group of technological changes that allowed off-chain innovation and scaling to happen. Now, this is speculative. I agree, this is speculative. They wanted to give it a shot about whether you could create this thing called the Lightning Network, and then rather than breaking the core BTC, which I know Roger's going to say it is broken, but it's still working.
Do you disagree that it's broken? It went from no fees, most transactions were completely free, to the average transaction fee. The average was $50 per transaction, and anybody running a business was paying more than $1,000 often for one single Bitcoin transaction. Is that not broken to you?
It's not broken. It eliminated a certain user case, which is lower value transactions. And lower value transactions is an important user case, but it did get eliminated as we scale, and the core developers are looking at implementing off-chain solutions to allow for infinitely faster transactions, cheaper transactions, but it's speculative. We're not sure if that's going to work yet.
And so we saw what happened by that speculative risk. They risked the entire Bitcoin ecosystem, and Bitcoin went from having 95% market share to 35% market share.
But I'm not sure that's all transaction fees. I think my personal belief is
not only transaction fees. Not only did it make the fees go high, but instead of the transactions being instant, in the end of last year, the average wait time was almost 10 days for a transaction to be confirmed on the Bitcoin network. So it went for your average confirmation being 10 minutes to 10 days. Your fees went from being basically free to $50, and your wait to have your transaction confirmed went from 10 minutes to 10 days.
Is that the average or an extreme case?
In December last year, when the network was completely full, the average confirmation time on the Bitcoin Core network was 240 hours. That's about 10 days to get your transaction confirmed on the network. They completely broke the Bitcoin network, and we shouldn't be surprised at all that people started using things other than Bitcoin.
But this coincided with a time of record use, record adoption, record interest, record speculation, when we weren't really ready for the scale.
That people like myself and Gavin Andreessen, the person that Satoshi Nakamoto turned over the Bitcoin project to, and people like Mike Hearn, who is the senior capacity planner for a little company called Google, so certainly someone who knows about capacity planning, we have been warning for years that we needed to prepare for people to be able to use Bitcoin around the world.
But the community wouldn't reach consensus on that. If the debate was going on and on and on.
The community didn't reach consensus because there was censorship of anybody advocating a particular opinion that wasn't in line with the core developers. So the consensus that was reached was one that was reached via censorship. So if you censor any dissenting opinion, you wind up with consensus, and that's what we have. And instead, all of the people that were being censored went and started using things like Bitcoin Cash. And that's why I'm giving the same speech today that I've been giving about Bitcoin for over 7 years, and it's about Bitcoin Cash today. Bitcoin Core became some sort of a science project for a bunch of people that are openly hostile to the idea of using Bitcoin as money. Whereas for me,
But they're not
Bitcoin
openly.
is-
They're not openly hostile. I mean, they might have come
they
that way in order
mock
to
people
politically.
who use it
They,
as
they
money.
might have reached that way in order to politically, because it's got very political, and people tend to be, pitching the things that they're trying to
So
get.
Simon, if you
But
think Bitcoin
they believe that there's a different path to getting to cheaper transactions and more scale.
and we've seen that their path failed. They went from
Well, it's not over
95%
yet.
market
It's
share
certainly not over. 95%
to
is
35%. It's not over yet. Let's continue on the same trajectory and see what happens. I
well-
don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out, Simon.
Well,
You're a smart guy.
yeah.
We went from 95% to 35% as soon as the blocks became full.
The
And
95%.
you want to continue?
But yes, we did go from 95% to 35% and up where we are today. But I don't believe that was just because of transaction fees. It coincided with a series.
Horrible user experience that came along with it.
Not just a horrible user experience for microtransactions, but still you can do everything else apart from those smaller transactions without, that were taken away from that. But it coincided with, it's like, so when I was in the market, we used to have an index called the FTSE 100. And the FTSE 100 had another index called the Vodafone Domination, the Vodafone Dominance Index. And Vodafone was the most dominant stock within the FTSE 100. But what never changed about that is they didn't add 350 more stocks and 1,000 more stocks and then have this ginormous ICO bubble where it was creating more and more and more and more rich people that were speculating. They weren't spending these things. It was all speculation. It was rampant speculation. And all of those it was creating this ginormous amount of while you could call it competition, I don't think people were removing BTC in order to make a cheaper transaction. They were just trying to earn more BTC by speculating on other things, and then it goes back and forth, and it coincided with thousands and thousands of cryptocurrencies, people optimizing different user cases, people optimizing privacy, people optimizing cheaper, faster transactions, people optimizing smart contracts.
So I'm glad you mentioned privacy. That was another thing that was intentionally destroyed on the Bitcoin core network by limiting the block size. People used to be able to use all sorts of privacy tools so Bitcoin could be used privately. That's no longer the case on Bitcoin core because it became too expensive for anybody to afford to use any of those privacy tools. Whereas on Bitcoin Cash, all of those tools are now available again. And according to Ms. Fujimoto, I think we're about out of time. I'll give an update on our experiment here. Apparently there was a little bit of a language barrier because somebody along the line already had some Bitcoin. So when we got to the very end of the line, the Bitcoin Cash person still had exactly $10 worth of Bitcoin. It was in yen, but the person with Bitcoin Core had about almost $16 of Bitcoin Core because somebody along the line already had some money. But try this experiment at home with yourself. It's very, very clear. Bitcoin Cash transactions cost about 1/5 of a yen per transaction. Bitcoin Core transactions, depending on the day of the week, are somewhere between 20 yen and 200 yen in fees per transaction. And last year, when more people were still actually using Bitcoin, the fees got up to $50 per transaction on average. So anyhow, ask yourself, do you want the version of Bitcoin that's slow, expensive, and unreliable, Bitcoin Core, or the version of Bitcoin that's fast, cheap, and reliable, Bitcoin Cash? And it's not a tough decision, but I implore you all to think for yourselves. Thank you very much. Anything to add?
Let's do our closing because we could go. Is that your closing? Or?
That's my closing. Think for yourself.
Okay. All right. So what happened to me in 2017 is for the very first time in history, we saw young people's path change. By that I mean that many young people they were never going to be investing, they were never going to be savers. They were going to university, they were taking on credit cards, they were taking on their student loans, then they were going to get their job, and then they were going to get a mortgage, and then they were going to contribute to this increasing money supply, and they were never ever going to save. They were never going to buy bonds, they were never going to buy stocks, they were never going to buy gold, and some of them might actually get on a different path. Now,
Can I ask what this has to do with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin
Sure,
Core?
I'll get to that. So BTC, what happened with cryptocurrency sector in general is while it was called speculation, call it whatever you want, but for the first time, young people started thinking about saving and investing. And saving and investing, this cryptocurrency industry, changed, I believe, is changing the path of many of those young people into a new trajectory which isn't contributing to that economy that we were talking about. Now they could have their different flavors, and now there's unlimited options and unlimited things that they can think about. But I believe that where we are right now is not going to be one chain that does everything for everyone. I used to believe in that, but then the market, whatever happens, whatever the reasons that it happened,
the blocks became
that.
Full, and people started building another chain.
But it does not change the fact that I still believe that BTC is a unique innovation that has lots of rooms for improvement, that has lots of innovation that's coming through, and has a different path of the fork that came from that. And if people are optimizing for digital savings, and optimizing for digital cash, and optimizing for smart contracts, I believe it's up to entrepreneurs in the future to put together, with all these competing teams optimizing different things, applications that make it very easy for when you've got your Bitcoin and you need to get it somewhere else in a way that people want to receive it. The wallet, whatever, will just optimize, it will cross-chain, it will do things in the most optimal way. And I think that's the path that we're on right now. And what I would like to do, I will answer your question, I promise, is I believe that we are where we are. The censorship issue is a big thing. I'll support you on that, Roger. That is a problem, and there needs to be some accountability for that. But I do not want to see people deliberately trying to kill Bitcoin Cash in order to push Bitcoin Core, or Bitcoin, BTC trying to push BCH. I don't want to see the same. With the two chains do not need to try and kill each other in order to succeed. And I think we've reached the stage right now where we should allow people to optimize their chains. There's too much hate in this community. We've forgotten who the true enemies are. We've forgotten that banks are the winners. The US dollars can be the winner out of all this thing. And we need to reach some more harmony. I don't know how we achieve that, but I feel that I personally believe that Bitcoin Cash existing keeps Bitcoin Core developers more honest. Having competing things is important innovation. And I think that we need to move to optimizations of different user cases and try and get back to more harmony, because when we have the next systemic risk event, we're going to suddenly realize that we weren't enemies with each other, and we need to move forward. Because my final comment, when I saw you on the Alex Jones show, Roger, I remember the presentations it used to give, the presentations where inspiring the world to get into Bitcoin. And then when all of a sudden you go on Alex Jones and you're trying to explain to this completely new audience that might be using crypto for the very first time that Bitcoin's this thing that's going to change the world and all the things we believed in, and then at the same time, but it's got corrupted and therefore you should try and use this other thing, I think everyone just comes along and says, and then someone comes on.
They say Bitcoin Cash is Bitcoin because it's the same speech I've been giving for 7.5 years. It still completely applies to Bitcoin Cash. It's no longer true about Bitcoin Core. I didn't change.
Newbies
Bitcoin
cannot
Core
get that
changed.
message. Newbies
That's why
will
I'm helping
not get
spread
that
the
message.
message. Thank you, Simon.
Okay.
はい、ありがとうございました。